Good morning, colleagues. Many old friends who I've worked with in evaluation for many years are here, and new friends who I've met in Bangkok. And if you're not a colleague or a friend, please come up during the day and introduce yourself and say hello so we become so. Imagine spending 142 million pounds sterling. That's around 185 million American dollars. Would you like that budget? Imagine spending that on a single campaign with a single specific objective in a relatively short time frame, a few months. Imagine that campaign has a lot of research, a huge amount of research around it, during it, before it, and all of that research almost unanimously predicts a successful outcome. But the result was a complete failure. How can this happen? How can this happen? And someone has taken the slide changer. Oh no, it's down here. What I'm talking about, of course, is Brexit, as Barry suggested, or I call it B-Day, because on the 23rd of June last year, as you know, the UK went to a national referendum and voted on whether it would remain or leave the European Union after 40 years of membership. And this was quite a significant vote because this wasn't an open referendum where the government was neutral and said, tell us what you think. The government of the time came out quite explicitly and said, we recommend a Remain vote. The government actively campaigned to remain. And so I'm going to focus on how that ended up being the opposite of what the government asked for. I'm mainly going to talk about Brexit, but I'm also going to turn to something else I call T-Day. Anyone know what happened on the 8th of November 2016 on the other side of the Atlantic? Yes, we had the election of Donald Trump, also another hugely significant and shocking result, and I mean that in probably multiple ways, again, against almost all of the research that was being done. How can this happen? And these are not historical, well, I'll go down in history, but these are not issues from the past. These are issues very recently, so they're very current, and they're actually going to continue to shape our world generally and our world of research, because on the 8th of June, just a few weeks' time, the UK is going to a national election, and the departure from Europe, Brexit, will continue to be an issue in that election. Now, here in Bangkok, you may say, well, why study the UK government? I think David Watson's given us some great reasons why we probably should. But just to put the background to the research that I did, it's very interesting in the UK because we're talking about a communication area with a reputation for best practice. We're not talking about a small PR agency or someone with no money. We're talking, if anyone, the old guard here who've been to previous summits would have heard Alex Aiken speak. And I think you would agree with me, and Richard's talked about the Evaluation Council. There's many bits of data that indicate that this is a very professional government in terms of communication. Just a few examples in addition to what David mentioned. The UK, unlike some, even though they have communicators across all departments and agencies, they have a central professionalised service, the Government Communication Service. I've said 4,000 members, that's what Alex said, you've said 3.5, I'll defer to David, maybe more up to date. They are reducing communication staff. But in addition to every department having an annual strategic plan, the GCS has an overarching government communication strategic plan every year. They have a major, David didn't mention this, but one of the other initiatives is a major professional development program running constantly, training government communicators. They have extensive use of research, evaluation champions across all government departments and agencies. And Richard talked about the Evaluation Council that meets and decides whether or not certain campaigns can proceed. So there is a lot of evidence that this is a very professional outfit. Now, I must put a qualification in here. My research that I'm going to show you and some of the critiques don't all relate to communications GCS staff, because some of these were done by political staff, some were done by policy staff, but nevertheless, they're all part of communication and research and evaluation. So I just want to make that point that I'm not specifically talking about GCS, but a very professional government in terms of communication. At an even broader level, this is not a weak government, the government at the time. This is a government that was re-elected in 2015, just a year before, with an increased majority. And that hardly ever happens in the UK, right, David? So this is a very strong government with a very professional reputation for communication. So again, the question is, what the went on? What happened? Well, there were some warning signs, and here's where I start to dig into research. In 2014, some of you know, there was a referendum on Scotland. 44.7% of Scottish citizens voted to leave the UK. Now, can you imagine if a large slab of your company wants to secede and leave, or your organization? I think that's a warning sign that something's not quite right. And why is this happening? We also know from research there was rising public concern about issues like immigration, hugely rising concern about issues like the National Health Service. And I'll talk more about these later, because these were in the data. These were there, but they were not seen adequately or not adequately understood. So they went ahead, and by the way, the £142 million wasn't all communication. It's the estimated total cost of the referendum. But within that, there was a lot of research and a lot of communication. This media article talks about £10 million being spent just on information leaflets and posters. So again, would you like £10 million, $15 million US dollars to do a campaign? And as I said, it was a vote, a massive vote, not a massive percentage, but a majority percentage to leave the EU. So in the spirit of this conference, this is disruptive communication. If you don't believe me, consider that the Prime Minister, David Cameron, following Brexit, was forced to resign, or chose to resign, but under pressure. A new Prime Minister is appointed to lead the UK. 13 ministers either lose their job or are reshuffled in their portfolios. A whole new government department is established, the Department for Exiting the EU at number 9 Downing Street, commonly known as DEX-EU. There's public acknowledgement from the new Prime Minister within days that, in quotes, we do not understand the British people. So again, I'm throwing this out as a researcher. All this research is being done, all this communication is being done, and somehow we misread this historic decision. We didn't understand the people. So immediately, and I was doing research in the UK at this time, living in London, there is a call for, we need new research, we need insights, we need to understand how to build our strategy. And so today, in the limited time, I'm going to talk about just 5 of the key issues or the key learnings that came out of 6 months of research. I was there from before Brexit in June until after Christmas. I came back to Australia in January. And some of the things we learned during that period where I was doing research with full collaboration, I must say, with the Government Communication Service and many of the departments. I'm going to talk about 5 things in overview. I want to talk about formative research as opposed to, that's research beforehand as opposed to afterwards, and the question just came up about that. I want to talk about quantitative research and reliance on polls. I'll talk a bit about, very importantly, about how to do data analysis and the data analysis skills and tools we require. I'll talk about a lack of a centralized data center, bringing data together. And finally, I'll talk about something that I call outreach, and that'll make sense in a moment. Because the argument that I make is that long before the Brexit boilover, actually a lot of the signs were there. And I mentioned the Scottish referendum, but also we all know this, whether it's the Edelman Trust Barometer or the Harvard University research, worldwide in democratic countries, and particularly mature ones, there is declining trust in government. If you're in business, don't be too confident. There's declining trust in business. There's hugely declining trust in media. And there's also declining trust, particularly in areas like Wall Street and the financial sector. There's declining disengagement. Membership of political parties is falling in most of these countries that I'm talking about. Voter turnout is declining. Yeah, there's data everywhere. Nobody was bringing all this data together. There's a rise of extremism and radicalization, young people stepping out of our political system. In the corporate world, there's declining customer and employee loyalty. So what's going on? Long before we get to that decision, what's going on in the context? And you've heard context talked about, but only briefly at this summit. Evaluation starts with context, long before you plan your campaign. And so the project that I was involved in, the Organizational Listening Project, which sort of came out of evaluation research, started in 2014. And I looked at corporate and government, and one of the findings that emerged in my research as early as 2015 was that organizations have a serious lack of listening and engagement. We use the word engagement a lot, but when I looked at communication, what we call communication is between 80 and 95% distributing the messages of our organization, and about 40% of it is trying to get publicity in the media. It's not actually communication. That's putting out stuff, or as Alex Aiken calls it, SOS communication, sending out stuff, and in many cases, including in Brexit, it was sending out something else called S, starting with S. And that's Alex's words. Now, am I right, am I wrong? Well, here's my conclusion from my research that I wrote up from the research report is that Brexit, and this is important, was not a vote to leave the EU. It was actually a vote against the government and against the way the government was managing affairs generally. All of that context told us that story, but we look very narrowly at Brexit. If you don't believe me, it's interesting that the new Prime Minister, Theresa May, came out soon after being appointed and said a similar thing. The referendum was not just a vote to withdraw from the EU, it was about something broader, that people today have a world works for a privileged few, but not for them. But an even more important statement is this one. Theresa May again at the Conservative Party conference in October last year, Brexit was a revolution in which millions of our citizens stood up and said they're not prepared to be ignored anymore. I have never read a more condemning statement of communication and research as that. Ignored. That she's saying people have stood up and said they are being ignored. So what's missing in our research? All this data we've heard about, all these insights that we generate, something is missing. And I see a very close parallel with what happened in the United States, because the election of Donald Trump also went against all of the research, all of the polls, with I think the exception of one organization. To me, it was an election of Donald Trump was more a vote against Washington, D.C., the Republican Party, the Democrat Party, and all of the traditional mechanisms of government than it was a vote for Donald Trump. And the polls, as I said, got it wrong. So how good is our research? What can we learn from this? And let me get into the specifics. So my first of my 5 points is, and this came up just a few minutes ago, it worries me that in our industry, we don't actually understand the theory of evaluation. And I'm using the word evaluation, not measurement. And I say this to Barry all the time. If you're in the business of measurement, you're taking measures. So what? You've got a pile of data. It's evaluation we're actually in. We do measurement in order to decide value and determine value. So I'm talking about evaluation, which includes measurement. And there are 3 types. In any textbooks tells you, any research methods book, there are 3 types of evaluation: formative, process, and summative. Before, during, and after. And I think Richard said it very well before, it's an iterative loop. You do a lot of research beforehand, and quite personally, if I answered the question asked earlier about what percentage, I'd be spending 60% or more of my budget before, and I often do. And you know, otherwise you're taking off in a plane without a flight plan. You don't know where you're going. So this idea that evaluation, first of all, it's understood, it was understood in most of the polling, and it's understood in most of our industry as mostly something we do afterwards. We are good at summative evaluation. And evaluation, what was missing was really good formative research to really understand the audience, the circumstances they were in, the conditions they were in, how they were feeling, and then tracking during the campaign, because there were signs all through Brexit that something was not going to work out right. And then, of course, in the end, there was the post hoc polls that told us, oh my goodness, here's where we are. Anyone who wants to talk more about formative, process, and summative in this iterative loop, I'm doing a workshop at 2:30, and I will be talking more about that. Let me go on, and these 5 points link together. So, okay, lack of formative research, reliance on polling. So, what's wrong with the polling? Well, polling is a quantitative method, it's a survey, but there's a couple of very specific things wrong methodologically. Polls are not to be dismissed. They're nice for quick and dirty, fast answers. You can get them overnight almost. But think about this. Polls are normally always small samples. Most of the polls during Brexit and during the Trump election were between 1,000 and 2,000 people. Okay? That can be a legitimate, reliable sample in some circumstances, but a few other problems occur. Most of the polls use quota sampling, and again, I'll talk about these specifics in methodology this afternoon in the workshop. It's not something for a 20-minute keynote, but quota sampling is not statistically reliable because it's where you say a quota says we need to make sure we've got men and women. So let's take 50-50, or 48-52, whatever the population is. Let's take some from the north, the south. Let's make sure we get some from the east coast and the west coast. And it's useful to do that when you're trying to get a snapshot. But it's not statistically reliable. And yet we trust these polls. That's the second point. Thirdly, they also mostly use panels, because you can't organize a survey and find your sample quickly. So these are people who sign up and who get paid to fill out surveys. What sort of people are they? Right? Are they your normal people? Are they the silent majority who's angry and upset? No, they're the people who love filling out surveys. These are pretty much useless in research. And then polls ask only a few questions, often very shallow and very narrow, and it's how you ask the question. So I could ask people, on balance, do you think the UK should remain in the EU? People go, yeah. Will you vote for the Cameron government's Remain campaign? No way. I'm fed up with the government, I'm going to vote the opposite. Depends on the question you ask. And often they ask a rational question to an emotional public. Another point, most polls are run by media and they publish the results. So when you publish the results of the campaign, and of course there was a lot of forecasting, wasn't there, Richard? Oh, it's going to be a Remain vote, everyone's going to... So it becomes a form of push polling. Push polling is where the publication of results causes people to change their vote, because many Brits thought, oh, it's going to be a Remain campaign, God, Cameron's going to romp it in again, the government's arrogant, I'm going to vote the opposite just to send a message. And so the publication of poll results actually influenced the election. The final point I'd make, not just polling, but all quantitative research. Quantitative research is vitally important. Tina talked about it before, but I want to caution you to say, you can quote Albert Einstein if you like, that not everything we can count counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. And there are many examples in that, particularly we get into emotional issues, hidden issues, issues people won't talk about, that only qualitative research can bring out, that they won't tick a box on a survey, or they lie on surveys. I'll come back to that a little bit later. So that leads on to my third point, data. There's no question we had plenty of data. But the third thing I found in my research, and I'm going to give you a couple of chronic examples, is there was a lack of data, really high-level data analysis tools and skills. Partly lacking for the quantitative data, but particularly with qualitative data, because qualitative data is textual, unstructured data, we call it, focus groups, interviews, but also we often call data, and I've heard it at this conference, I must admit, data is associated with numbers. It's not. Data is what people say. Text is data. And so we're a little bit obsessed with just numbers, and the government had millions and millions of words in public consultations, in correspondence, letters, complaints, etc. Let me give you two examples of data and how data is not analysed and the catastrophic results that come from it. When I arrived there, I found out that the year before, one of the biggest consultations ever done in the UK is NHS, the National Health Service, do a NHS mandate consultation. And this is to ask people what do they want of their National Health Service. A very important consultation. They normally expect anywhere from 300 to 3,000 submissions. In 2015, they got 127,400 submissions. Now, right away, quantitatively, wouldn't you think something's going on? 127,400 submissions, many of which were 10, 12, 15 pages long. They were from health professionals, doctors, nurses, as well as patients and citizens. And so right away, I would think that if I got 127,000 submissions on this issue, something's going on out there. I really want to get to the bottom of it. Within the Department of Health and the very dedicated people in NHS England, Public Health England, they did not have any software tools that could analyse over 1 million pages of public feedback. They worked hard to do some manual work, but basically they never analysed it. Never analysed it. 1 million pages of public feedback. Another quick example, similar thing, every government department, and you could apply this to companies as well, receives letters. Most departments receive it. The UK Prime Minister receives about 100,000 letters a year. Again, they were not analysed. Now, we talk about insights in this conference. But so 100,000, why would you write to the Prime Minister? Why would you write to the President? because you're upset about something. You don't write to say, well done, sir, do you? You write because you're upset about something. So in there's something. Insights are not repeating what's in there, but what about, wouldn't you want to know what are the trends? What are the main issues people are writing about? What are the issues that are growing? What are the issues that are declining? That's insights. It's there in the data, but you've got to pull it out. And I'll tell you, a robot's not going to pull it out. It's human understanding, it's detailed analysis. And so part of my research, and this was action research, which is a method you may not have used, is where not only do you identify the problem, but you try and build solutions. So while I was there, we brought in some software, some high-end machine learning software, a program called Method 52. It was brand new, developed by Demos and the university colleagues. We trained staff, and we reanalyzed 127,400 submissions. So to prove the point, we did it. And boy, oh boy, we found so many key, 7 major findings, many of them about immigration issues. You might say, what's the health service got to do with it? But they blamed EU illegal and legal immigration as undermining the beloved National Health Service of England. So that consultation, one of the major findings, is it was blaming the European Union. There was a key finding, never discovered. So quickly following on from that, how am I going, Barry? I'm running out of time. Data everywhere. Volumes of data, as I've indicated, but it's also held on all different servers. Every department holds its own research behind firewalls, and there was no ability to share the data. No central data or knowledge management system in the UK government. That now is also being worked on. The 5th comment I'd quickly make is outreach. Because we do listen, we do get data, but who are we listening to? And here's another quick quote from the Prime Minister. Can I have 2 more minutes, Barry?
Yeah.
Knock on any door in almost any part of the country and you'll find the roots of the revolution laid bare. Here's the Prime Minister acknowledged, and you've only got to go and knock on doors and anyone would tell you what was going to happen in Brexit. So again, how did this happen? Well, very simply, we don't knock on doors. We passively manipulate and process data. And we process the data that people give us. We stakeholder data, passive feedback data, etc. So we tend to engage with the usual suspects, the survey filler-outers. Just a quick point about surveys. A Harvard study has found that 70% of surveys sent to households are filled out by one of the children. And close to that number sent to business executives are filled out by their secretaries. Right? Be careful with data. Auto-generated data, these things are useful indicators, but they often don't give us the deep insights we want. I'll skip over that one, but just notice the title of that person on the bottom is saying what I just said, digital sociologist. These are some of the people that are doing the work. And that happens because we're living in a bubble. We are listening, but we're listening inside a bubble. Politicians live in a bubble, the Brussels bubble, the Westminster bubble. They listen to 2 bodies, political parties. Another key fact that I looked at very quickly in the UK, and it was shocking. The total membership, politicians are elected by political parties, they draw their policies from political parties. The total membership of the 3 largest political parties in the UK is 1.6% of eligible voters. So they're listening to their political party, and it's 1.6%. They listen to mainstream media, and that's also declining. I'm going to flick to the end. This bubble we're in, we do listen, we do research, but we must be careful we're listening, that we're only not just listening to the survey filler-outers, the people who are sending us information. We need to go outside in outreach and harvest information, because that bubble can burst. Conclusions, much more formative research. Understanding stakeholders and audiences. Understanding evaluation happens before, during, and after. Invest in in-depth qualitative research as well as quantitative research. Develop advanced data analysis tools and skills for analyzing unstructured textual data as well as numeric data. Integrate and triangulate data and get out of the bubble. Sometime we've got to do outreach and go out and actually remember the silent majorities, the people who don't offer us information. We've often got to go out and harvest that. I'm ending, Barry. The detailed findings that I've skipped over is in a research report that's available, but it's also available free online to download. So in the slide deck, you'll get the link and you can download a 48-page report with very, very detailed research findings. And some of the methodological issues, which I'll talk more about this afternoon, are in a brand new book. It's 2018 date, but it's coming out in August, a 400-page book that I've just finished writing on evaluating public communication. Thank you.
quite brilliant as ever. We will, of course, make Jim's PowerPoint presentation this morning available on download. It'll be available 24 hours' time. But I do recommend that you consider downloading from the screen. Let's go to questions.
Hey, Jim. Here,
Hi.
Claudio. Okay. I knew that measurement were about listening, but now I see that is about reading as well. So my question is, how do you work to inform tools that analyze non-structured texts, the context of this analysis? That's my question.
Well, this industry is well placed in one sense, is that a lot of you do content analysis. You can broaden that slightly with more semiotic and discourse understanding, because thematic analysis, narrative analysis, textual analysis is really just a slight expansion of content analysis, and you can apply it to any text, interview transcripts, focus group transcripts, public consultation data. So there's a whole data set out there that this industry has skills to use on and doesn't actually use. The main part of the question was, how do you connect? Sorry, yes, triangulation of multiple data sets, because you don't just analyze media or don't just analyze submissions, etc., but look at the context. So what available data? Literature research, third-party data. So I'm accessing, when I'm looking at trust, I'm accessing Harvard University research, OECD research. How many of you in the room, when you report to clients, report other than your own research? How many of you report data that's available out there that sets the context? So I look at OECD, Harvard University, Oxford University, all these places publish data. When you bring multiple data, you can't get insights from one data set. You can be totally wrong. It's like navigation. You take one bearing and you sail to it, you're in trouble, or fly to it. You take multiple bearings, and where they converge, that's the accuracy. Right. So multiple data sets.
Next question, have you got a microphone?
It's Shan from Isentia. It's just a quick question. Do you see any obvious difference between analyzing or evaluating for the corporate communication versus analyzing for political issues like the Brexit or the Trump election? Thank you.
Good point. No, I don't, because everything you do in communication or measurement comes from one area. What are the objectives? They should be smart objectives. So what is the objective and what is the audience? And that's all you need to know. So if the audience is corporate or business to business, what is your objective? And therefore you have to measure it. And I'll talk this afternoon about methods. There's no one method. You have to then choose the method that's appropriate. In my case, I use content analysis of documents, but I used ethnography. I lived there for 6 months inside government. I watched, I observed. After a while, I was a fly on the wall. They forgot I was there. They said things they never should have said, and so on and so forth. So I use action research, and we do have to use more than one method, and I think that's one of the challenges. I wouldn't be hiring lots of communication people. I would hire communication professionals to interface with the client, to present and turn the data to strategy, but in the middle, I'd be hiring digital sociologists, data analysts, sense-making methodologists, etc., to do the data and the methodological work.
There'll be a lot of questions and an opportunity, obviously, at networking breaks, but also in Jim's session this afternoon. Last question of this session is Mazen Hawi.
Professor, I don't want to be, I'll play devil's advocate, even though I agree with you. How would we describe the success of French polling in their election, which turned out to be spot on? I know that you challenged what happened in the UK, but clearly something is different in how it happened in the French election. And second, again, I do agree with you, but how would you respond to people who would say, had it not rained on Brexit vote day, it would have gone in favor of the Remain campaign?
I'll answer the first part really briefly, because I have to say I don't know. I will not give advice or answer a question unless I have really good data. I don't have data on the French election, so I think it's very wise not to advise a client if you don't know the answer and have good evidence. With the Brexit, yes, it rained, but I don't think that was the issue, because when you look at the breakdown of the vote, one of the big groups that didn't vote were young people. Now, young people benefit greatly by being able to go and work in Europe, and they're now mad as hell because they've lost that benefit. And so there was a real failure in the Remain campaign to motivate young people to get out and vote. Older, angry, frustrated, working class people voted. A lot of educated people voted on issues of sovereignty and being more British, etc. So I think probably the lack of the youth vote was probably more significant than a rainy day. Rainy days are fairly normal in London, I've got to say.
Take no notice.
Thank you, Barry.
Thank you very much. Congratulations again on your award.